Well, first off, thank you for attending today's installment of Transportation Tidbits. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted later this week. You can access these anytime after they're posted by logging into your WASBO profile. You'll also get that link in your email. If you have any questions, please raise your hand using the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen if you wish to speak. You may have to hover to get that to show up. Otherwise, WASBO staff will monitor the Q&A and the chat windows. You should be able to use either or. If you are invited to speak, please make sure that you mute once you are done to avoid background noise for other attendees. And watch for an email from WASBO this afternoon with the link to evaluate today's transportation tidbits. Your feedback will help us plan for future topics and presenters. WASBO staff will also put the link in the chat window at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll pass the baton to today's presenters, Olivia Bernitt and Kathy Fry from the School Financial Services team at the DPI. Thank you for joining us today, ladies.
Thank you. Olivia, go ahead and introduce yourself if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm Olivia Bernitt. I'm a school finance auditor here at DPI. Been here for almost 4 years now. Yeah.
And I'm Kathy Fry. I am a school administration consultant, and I work with transportation, hazardous transportation, high-cost transportation, and other things, but those are my three main transportation responsibilities. And I'm going to share my screen now. We have a presentation to go through with you, and then if you have questions, like Caitlin said, just raise your hand in the reactions tab down on the bottom of your screen, or you can put your questions into the chat, and we'll try to watch for those as they come in. So today's topic is transportation aid reporting and the audit that goes with that. And I'm going to share my screen. Excuse my voice. I've had kind of this crud that's going around that everybody has for about a week and a half now. And I'm hoping to get through with it pretty quickly because I'm really tired of it. So again, the two of us, our contact information will be given to you at the end, but I work with the reporting part, and Olivia will explain what auditors are looking for when they audit your reports. So, sources of transportation aid. There are several ways that you can receive aid as a district for transportation. The basic one is your regular transportation of students. There is also summer school and interim transportation, high-cost transportation aid, and special education transportation aid, which is not generally reported within the regular portal. Any kids who are provided specialized transportation through their IEP are generally reported through special education reporting. Students qualifying to receive pupil transportation and actually participating in one of the Fund 10 programs from those three separate calculations will also bring you aid. And that is based on the distance from the student's residence to the school they attend following the shortest commonly traveled route. The PI 1547 SS is the summer school transportation reporting. You can count students who are public school students and private school students transported to attend summer sessions and or interim sessions during your school year. This report sort of starts out the fiscal year because you do this at the end of in September. So you're kind of at the end of the summer school term. It's the first transportation reporting that you would do for the year. It is based on the previous year's ridership. And you do it after the previous school year ends and the current school year begins. Sometimes there's some overlap because if you have summer school during June, you will actually report that in the following fiscal year. So there can be a little bit of, you're doing the summer school reporting in June, and so that actually goes into the following fiscal year. If you have interim sessions during the previous school year, this is reported on this PI 1547 SS. And there is only one category to report anymore. It used to be that you reported how many days the students rode the bus, but now it is only the distance. And there's only two categories. It's 2 to 5 miles or over 5 miles. This is also part of the transportation audit process. The PI 1547 is the regular school year transportation report. You can report public and private school students who are transported during the regular school year by districts and charter schools. The report generally opens in May and is due in late July, and that you're working with the previous year's data. There are 5 distance categories, and only districts that have a DPI approved unusually hazardous transportation plan, UHT plan, which we talked about in the last transportation tidbits session. Only those schools who have the approved plans can enter riders in the less than 2 miles category. If you don't have an approved plan and you go into your report and you try to enter students who live less than 2 miles, you won't be able to enter anything. You're not able to even access that category if you don't have an approved plan. Per board policy, that means your individual school boards can decide this. You may transport and include open enrolled in students from the district border to the school of attendance. Unless you have a mutual agreement with your neighboring district for the bus to cross boundary lines, that is generally not done. But if the students are brought to a bus stop within your district, you can transport them and you can count them. The district can also include students transported based on contracts with a parent or a service provider. If you have private school students that you don't run a bus for and you do parent contracts, you do get to count those students in your transportation aid reporting. Districts are responsible to provide reliable documentation and not undocumented assumptions or estimates to support the number of pupils reported as actually transported at least once during the school year. What that means is you need to have some sort of documentation, whether your transportation department at your district does this, or if you are contracting for transportation with a busing company, if they do it, but you do need to have documentation of who has ridden the bus and how and where they live. Best way to do this, I think, is make sure that you at least do this twice a year and do it right around the pupil count dates. It'll make you remember it, and it'll be done at the same time as something else. So it's an easier thing to make sure that it gets done. The qualifying distance that the student was transported can come from your transportation director or your contractor. And $24 million is distributed based on these 2 reports from the previous school year. And the distribution is in January, which was when the majority of the money gets sent out, and in June when everything is finalized after audits are done and any audit findings are taken into account, the remainder of the payment goes out. High-cost transportation aid is a different source of funding, and only certain districts qualify for it. It is paid in June for the previous school year based on your audited information. This program provides additional funding to school districts that have higher per pupil transportation costs when compared to the statewide average. It is very hard to predict who is going to get this high cost transportation aid from one year to the next, because it's based on everybody's costs and then your costs compared to everyone else's in the whole state. So it's really hard. I've had people ask me, can you estimate what we're going to get for high costs this year? And the answer is I can't really. It's very dependent on how much other districts spend, and who all is qualifying for it during that year. The allocation for 23-24 has been raised from $19,856,200 to $22,800,000. So there will be a little bit more money available this year. You must have a cost that exceeds 140% of the state average per student cost of transporting the students. And you must also have 50 students per square mile or less. So that part of it, the second part of it doesn't really change much, but the first part of it, depending on what everybody else spends, it could be that you qualify one year and you don't the next year. Very hard to predict. So this is kind of our aid calendar. You can also find this online, I believe, but you will also get a link to this this presentation slide deck after the session is over. I'm sure WASBO is going to be sending that out, so you can come back and refer to this. But you can kind of see here the regular transportation aid for the 22-23 school year is, you know, it's right here. This is what it. Whoops, I'm sorry. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay there. I clicked by accident. Sorry about that. So the aid is paid out based on this period of time. The report is done here in July, due in July. You have your audits during July through early fall. Once the audit report is done, then the transportation aid is calculated for January. Any audit findings are done here in March and April, and then the final calculation is done, and the final aid amounts are paid out in June. So in June of 2024, you'll be receiving aid for the 22-23 school year, and most of you have already received your January 22-23 payouts. For
Hey,
summer,
Kathy,
yes.
a quick question that came in through the chat from a couple slides back.
Okay.
Can an open enrolled student be counted on the transportation aid report if they get on at an eligible stop in the district's boundary?
Yes. Yes. That's what I meant by you cannot cross the boundary to pick the student up. But if they go to a bus stop within your district's boundaries, you can pick them up and you can count them for aid.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome. So this is what I was mentioning before with the summer school transportation reporting. The categories have been honed way down. You either report 2 to 5 miles or over 5 miles. For the students that you're transporting between 2 and 5 miles, you get $10 per student, and over 5 miles, $20 per student. You do not any longer have to count how many days they rode the bus. And there are only these two categories of mileage, nothing else. If they live with less than 2 miles from school for the summer school reporting purposes, you are not able to count them, even if you have a UHT plan. It's only these 2 to 5 and over 5 miles categories. And you are not required to transport for summer and interim sessions to the same standard as during the regular school year. And what I mean by that is, if you transport students for summer school, you have to make reasonably similar accommodations to different areas of your district. Or you can just decide you're not going to transport the students, and if they want to attend summer school, they have to get there on their own. But if you do, you have to make sure that you're giving kind of an equal opportunity for students to ride the bus. For regular school year reporting, there are more categories. And again, if you're transporting students within a 2-mile radius of their schools, you must have a UHT plan in place, and that is $15 per pupil. 2 to 5 miles is $35. Over 5 and up to 8 is $55. Over 8 and up to 12 is $110. And for 23-24 reporting, the allocation was raised from $375 to $400 per student for over 12 miles away from their school. Pupil transportation aid is determined by the number of students who are actually transported from a residence to their school of attendance. And it can be public school or private school at least once during the school year. Pardon me, excuse me for a minute. Sorry about that. So it is to your advantage to encourage people to have kids ride the bus at least once, because you are going to be able to count them even if they only ride the bus one time. I don't know how to advise you how to do that exactly, but it really is to your advantage if kids ride the bus at least once during the school year. When the district transports fewer students, the regular pupil transportation aid will be less in their January payment following the following school year. So that's basically saying your data is from the previous school year and your payout comes in this school year. After the January aid payment, the remainder of the funds, minus the aid for the transportation over ice for Bayfield, is paid out in June based on the district's percentage of state pupil transportation aid in January. The transportation over ice has been generally about $35,000. Last year, it was a lot less. The allocation is for $35,000, but we've had such mild winters, and I assume the same will be in the case for this year, because I don't think anything's even frozen over up north this year. So there might be a little bit of extra money in the pot, because Bayfield probably won't claim the whole amount. That is the
another
only district that
question.
does that. Yes.
Oh, another question in the chat, Kathy. If the
Yes.
student is a special education student with an extended school year in their IEP, the district has to transport them, correct?
That is correct. But if they are only riding a bus, a special education bus due to their IEP, that is not reported in regular transportation reporting. I hope that makes sense. And we'll get to some scenarios about that a little bit further on here. But basically, if a student is only riding a special education designated bus, they are not reported in the general regular transportation aid report. The funding for that comes through a special education fund.
Okay, thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome. So here's a couple of scenarios again. If a student is transported to a daycare location, and you can do this, you don't have to do this, but if you do transport students to daycare, if the most direct route to the daycare location is longer in mileage than the most direct route to the student's residence, the district must make the mileage category determination based on the residence location. So basically, when you're reporting students, you're always using the distance from their residence to their school. If a student moves during the school year, you count them as to the best advantage of your district. So in other words, if they lived 2 miles away from school, 2.5 miles away from school at the beginning of the year, and they moved to somewhere out in the country, and they fall in the next highest category, you can count them in that higher category. The determination of the mileage category does not need to be modified for the given school year as long as the student continues residing in the school district. So if that scenario were reversed, you could still count that student if they rode the bus one time from that farther location. You can count them in that higher mileage category. If the student is being transported by a parent or a third party, if you have a contract for private school students, for instance, if you are paying for it, the student can be counted in the mileage category that reflects the most direct route from the residence to the school of attendance. So, for example, if you have a private school student who is going to a Catholic school that's 2 miles outside of town, instead of running a bus there, you can do a parent transportation contract with them, and you can count them for that mileage category. I hope that makes sense.
A couple more questions came in, Kathy.
Sure.
First, regarding the transportation determination for daycare, would we use the daycare location regardless if we have never transported the student to and from their residence?
No, It's always based on where the student lives.
Okay. The next question. So what distance do you report for the open enrolled student? Presumably the distance from your in-district pickup point to the school the student attends rather than their address.
That is correct, because you're not going to be able to use their home address. You'd
Okay.
be crossing the boundary line to pick them up at their home address. So yes, wherever that stop is where they get on the bus, it's that mileage category.
And then next question, maybe one we need to hold for Olivia, but what documentation by the school district do the audit standards require for number of student riders?
Yeah, I think we should wait and let Olivia answer that, because I think she might
Awesome.
go over that in her part of the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. So obviously this is not the third question, but this was taken from another document, some Q&A. Must a public school district provide transportation to private pupils on the days the public school is not in session? And an opinion from the Attorney General in 1972, which still stands, stated that a public school board is required to provide transportation for private school pupils attending school on days when the public school district is not in session. It is really to your advantage to work with your private schools in your area and try to make your calendars as contiguous and homogeneous as you can. It's to your advantage because you will be required to transport those kids on days when you don't have school if your calendars are not the same. The same thing, and I can guarantee in the fall, the first snow day, I will get a call from several public school or private schools saying, we don't want to let our kids out of school early, and the public school wants to. What do we do? Don't they have to transport our kids? And the answer is generally yes, but there should be some kind of an agreement that you come to with your private schools to say, if we let out of school early, we want you to let out of school early as well. You are on the hook for it, but you can work with your private schools and try to get everything as standardized as possible and get all of those things worked out ahead of time before school starts. That would be my advice too. The Wisconsin Court of Appeals confirmed that position in 1979, and it's again, it still stands. It's beneficial to both the public and private schools in the same school district to have school calendars which are as consistent as possible. And again, that's just kind of reiterating what I said. There are a couple of links here that you will have access to once you have a copy of the slide deck here.
Quick question, Kathy.
Yes.
If so the question is, does that ruling apply to snow days? And I'm going to say that, if the public school closes and the private school chooses not to, does the public school district still have to provide transportation?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I mentioned. Get that stuff worked out ahead of time and try to come to an agreement with your private schools. You are responsible for transporting them. So best thing to do is have an agreement before school starts that says, if we let out early because of inclement weather, I'm hoping that you as a private school will follow our lead, and we will have a consistent policy on how we handle that. Otherwise, yes, you are required to transport them, and that's going to cost you a lot of money if you don't have that worked out ahead of time. So my best advice is talk with your private school administrators, make sure that everybody's on the same page about pupil in-service days, teacher in-service days, early release days, late start days, inclement weather days. Make sure that you've kind of worked out together what your calendar is going to look like and what you're going to do in certain instances. So you're welcome. Best practices. If you have new employees that are going to be working on the transportation reporting or tracking or any of that, provide some kind of a training, develop a district year at a glance, and have a review process for how you're accounting for these students riding the bus. Meet with your transportation vendor or your transportation department employees regularly, including before student counts. And again, I would suggest that you do at least 2 counts a year one of them right around the third Friday in September, one of them right around the second Friday in January, so that you have at least 2 times of the year that you know you're going to be taking a look at who's riding the bus. While your 1 pupil count is required per year, again, additional counts will provide documentation and probably increased ridership numbers, at least twice a year. Again, otherwise, even more if you can do it, maybe once a quarter. But just make sure that you are documenting who's riding the bus. I think there is some software out there that some of the bus companies are using. I'm not familiar with what the name of it is, but it will make it easier to track those kids. But I know this is not an easy thing to do, but probably at least twice a year, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, you want to make sure that you've got some documentation on who's riding the bus. Complete your counts ahead of time, do a double check, and predict what is different this year and plan how to address it. Obviously, a reduction in your ridership is going to mean a reduction in your aid. So you want to make sure that you know ahead of time and are able to budget for that if that's the case. This is dealing with special education students. If a kid only rides specialized transportation according to their IEP, they are not eligible for pupil transportation aid. However, I had a question the other day. I have a student that rides a regular bus to the school, and then they are transported with a special education vehicle to another location. Can I count that student in the transportation aid regular reporting? And the answer to that is yes. There are instances when special education students can be counted in both places. But if they only ride specialized transportation due to their IEP, they are not counted in the regular transportation aid reporting. And unless there are questions for me at this point, I am going to turn this over to Olivia about talking about what they're looking for, what auditors are looking for when they do your audit, and what DPI looks for as well.
Caitlin, any questions?
Nope, I don't see any new questions. Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, sounds good. So I first want to start out, I don't have a separate slide for it. It's something that's in the process of kind of changing over a little bit. It doesn't have anything to do with a change in the program itself. But this past year, Department of Administration, so DOA, updated their state single audit guidelines to better align with the OMB compliance supplement. And with that, they are looking to no longer allow state agencies to have programs designated as either major or type A programs. Currently, the transportation program is considered a designated type A program, which means that it's something that the auditors have to do a risk assessment on every year. And one of the questions in the risk assessment is, has it been audited in one of the last 2 years? Meaning that the program would be tested or audited at least once every 3 years. Now with this change, we're expecting that districts are probably going to see the program be audited a little less often. That doesn't mean it won't be audited at all. For larger districts, they're still likely going to be a type A program and still be audited at least once every 3 years. For ones that are smaller, they still may get tested just because of meeting the amount of dollars needing to be tested in state aid, or the auditors need to do a risk assessment over a smaller program. So it's something that still expect to be tested, but it may not be tested quite as often. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly, since that's something that is going to be new going forward. But the program itself, it's something that is in the Wisconsin School District Audit Manual, which is something that we here at DPI put out. The program, it's 3 different compliance requirements. The first one being this activities allowed or unallowed, or allowable cost. The second is eligibility, and the third is reporting. All of these really are kind of exactly what they sound like. So your activities allowed are really making sure that the costs are allowed for that program. What I have on the slides here are as the part of the program. The way the program is set up, it kind of goes through the requirements and then there's suggested audit procedures. So what I have on the slides are kind of summarizing what the suggested audit procedures are. So for this first one, allowability, what the auditors are really looking at is to make sure, like I said, the costs are allowed for the program. So for example, that first one here, that the pupils, they're being transported at the expense of the district and the district isn't getting reimbursed through fees that they're charging for that transportation. Um, Other areas of activities allowed that are being looked at relate to, like Kathy talked on with the Fund 27, that the routes, anything related to Fund 27 is only going to Fund 27, only those specialized routes. And then lastly, with vocational pupils, if you do have those, that vocational pupils are being transported to a vocational program site. Um, yeah, next slide. So the next one is eligibility. This really looks at kind of two different areas for eligibility. The first one is, as Kathy discussed, the um, pupils being transported at least once during the year. And then the second is really related to that 0 to 2 mileage category, with being in accordance with the UHT plan. So for the first one, um, and kind of to maybe speak on the question that was asked earlier, for that documentation that the auditors are going to be looking at, I would say that really can differ by district, really dependent on how you're tracking, um, like the pupils being counted. But the auditors not only are going to be looking at the documentation, they're also going to be looking to make sure that the district does have a process in place to be making sure that the students rode at least once a year. So as Kathy talked about earlier, having possibly set days on when that's when the students are kind of marked as uh, riding the bus, whatever the district has kind of in process to make sure that they are counting students that did actually ride, and so that districts are not counting students that maybe are eligible to ride the bus but never actually rode the bus. So they'll be looking at that documentation that the district has, which can be something that comes maybe from, it sounds like some bus companies have a system or a software that districts can use, but if there's something else that you use in your system, um, to track that, it's just whatever the district has for tracking that the students are riding at least once a year. And then that second area, like I said, is that UHT plan. Um, and so what that's looking at is making sure that if students are counted in the 0 to 2 mile category, um, are they in accordance with that UHT plan? So making sure that if a student is in that, that they do fall in the UHT plan. And then additionally, looking to make sure that the UHT plan has been properly updated for current conditions is another thing auditors will be looking at. So what that really will just be is has there been any major changes with, the area right around the schools that would need to be updated in the plan? It sounds like that the UHT plan was talked about in some detail at the last one of these presentations. So hoping if you were able to attend that people have a pretty good understanding on that. And then, yeah, next slide. So the last requirement is related to reporting. And that really has to do with the reports that are submitted to DPI and making sure that that documentation matches the district's documentation matches what was reported. So what the auditors would be looking at here is going to be they'll be looking at the numbers that were reported in that PI 1547 and the PI 1547 SS. And what they'll be wanting to see from the district is wherever the district is tracking this, whatever documentation system that the district is using, that you'll be able to provide the auditors with these are where the counts come from. So they'll want to be able to tie out the amounts in each of the categories to that documentation that the district has on hand. Um, They'll also here be doing that some more of the testing of the students. So here they'll be doing they'll test some of the mileage. So they'll test to make sure that the mileage that the district calculated from the pupil's residence to the school was calculated correctly, and that the student is in the correct count category. Looking at again that UHT plan, the 0 to 2 mileage. And then this is where they'll be doing the testing to make sure that the students were transported at least once during the year. Another part of reporting is looking at some multi-year comparisons, reasonability type of checks. There could be specific circumstances for a district to have had their numbers change from year to year, but in most years, unless there was something else that occurred, usually the numbers are going to be pretty similar from year to year. So something that's always a good thing for you to do as a district when you're going in and completing these reports is to make sure that you take a look at the kind of current year versus the um, prior year and seeing like was there a major swing that you maybe weren't expecting? In that case, is it possible that maybe students were double counted or in one of the categories or something else that happened? So just taking a look at that before, like when you're entering the data is something good to do as well. And then next slide. Yep. Okay. So then the other thing I wanted to talk about was just some common transportation findings that we see when we are reviewing the audits that come in at the end of the year. Um, so again, all of these that are up here are all pretty much the areas that I just kind of walked through over the 3 different compliance requirements. So that first one is not having any physical documentation or the documentation doesn't tie. So that's just going to be if either the district doesn't have anything to provide to the auditor to support where they got the numbers from that are being reported on the PA 1547 or 1547 SS, or if the numbers that they have don't actually tie to what was submitted. So we'll see findings for that. We also see um, if the district either has pupils that were counted that never rode the bus, so they either just use, instead of doing some sort of having a day or having 2 days during the year, quarterly, or however the district decides to do that, if they don't actually ever test to make sure that the students did ride the bus at least once during the year, but just went off of who would be eligible to ride the bus. That would be something that we see findings on, um, or just the district not having those procedures in place to determine on if pupil did ride or not. Um, the next two kind of go together. They're reported in the incorrect category or the mileage calculated incorrectly. Usually the reason a student's reported in an incorrect category is typically because the mileage was calculated incorrectly by the district, whether that be just it was kind of they didn't take the shortest route or whatever reason that may be. It just was the student was put in the wrong or category because the mileage wasn't counted correctly. And then the last two findings that we see really relate to the UHT plan. Um, that first one being that there were students that were included in the 0 to 2 range that were not in the UHT plan. As Kathy stated earlier, if the district doesn't have a UHT plan, they shouldn't even be able to put any students in that category. But if they do have a UHT plan, that doesn't necessarily mean that every student is eligible to be in that 0 to 2 category. So the auditors will be looking to see and make sure that any students that were transported in that category are actually meeting the UHT plan. And then the last one there is just, again, not updating for any significant development. We don't see that finding quite as often, but we do see that. I think we had maybe one last year related to that. Next slide. So yeah, last thing to kind of go over is just some tips for a successful audit. So as I mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin School District Audit Manual is something that we put out every year. We do update it every year. So the link that I provided is just the link to the website where it gets posted. We put the updated manual sometime in the spring. So in the next couple of months here, we'll have the new one posted for the auditors to use for the upcoming audit, for the upcoming 23-24 audit. Um, the manual itself, isn't super long for like the school district one, but for the specific program related to transportation audit, it's only about 3.5 pages. So it's not a super long program. It's not something that's super complicated. It really just is going through that documentation, the processes, making sure that students are reported in the right categories. So if you know if you have like an earlier conversation with the auditors and it sounds like they are going to be testing transportation for the year, I think it would definitely be a good idea to take a look through the program. Like I said, it's pretty short for the transportation parts, so it should really only take maybe 5-10 minutes to go through. But yeah, and then any questions you have, always feel free to ask myself or Kathy for any questions. If you send it to me and it's more for Kathy, I can send it to her way, and vice versa. It's, you know, if she said if there's something for me that gets sent to her, we can always send to each other. But
Awesome. Well, thank you, ladies. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat. First is there a document of what is considered hazardous conditions? For example, traffic count, lack of sidewalks, etc. Is there a document that exists with that?
There really isn't a document. So just quickly, to establish an unusually hazardous transportation zone, what you need to do is talk with your county sheriff and say, this area that's within 2 miles of this school has a high traffic count, has no sidewalks, doesn't have crossing guards, that kind of thing. And one of the requirements for submitting an area to be approved for UHT is that your sheriff has to go and do an investigation, and then they also have to write up a letter that goes to DPI that says, yes, we agree that this is an area that seems to be unusually hazardous for students to be walking in. There are 3 parts to that. You need to establish your area, so you need a zone map with a mileage indicator on it, or a listing of the areas around the school that you're hoping to get this approved for. And you need to have your county sheriff, not your city police department. It must be the county sheriff. That is a statutory requirement. But the county sheriff, he needs to agree with the plan that you have put together, and your school board also needs to vote on the plan. All 3 of those things need to be submitted to me, to DPI, and there is a 30-day period of no action, because people who are in the area can then, once you've submitted a plan, they can try to appeal it if they don't like it. So after that 30 days is done, then within the next 30 days, DPI must approve the plan, or make a ruling on whether or not they think the plan should be going as a UHT. That's just a really quick overview, but as far as any documentation, no, there really isn't anything that says this is what makes an area unusually hazardous.
And related to that, a district that had a UHT approved this year, can they start counting those pupils for the start of the same school year, or do they have to wait until next year to start claiming those as UHT?
No, it's effective with the year that the plan is approved. So you are actually going to be you report kind of last year's data. So if you have a plan that's been approved this year, it's actually going to be able to be applied to the data that you have reporting coming up for the following school year. I hope that made sense.
It did.
Okay.
Olivia, this one was the one from earlier for you. What documentation by the school district do the audit standards require for the number of student riders? So a little different than that mileage documentation.
So I guess I think how I took it. I mean, they should have documentation for like the students that, like if they do, when they count or make sure that the student rode the bus at least once a year, having that documentation. I mean, any documentation pretty much that makes up how they came up with the number of students and how they report or completing the report in the system.
Mhm.
I don't, there's not necessarily a set, like it has to be these documents, because I mean, it can differ based on if the district is using like one of those programs that the bus companies have, if they're using something in their system. It's just really whatever the district has for documentation. If there's like a log, the bus drivers code, like whatever the district has to support the numbers.
Thank you. Another one, could an audit finding result in having to return the categorical aid? What's the standard remedy?
I can start, Kathy. I might have you jump in as well, but it could. It depends on what it is. So I mean, some of the findings we do get do have like question costs related to it, related to like students that were reported in incorrect count categories. So Kathy, I don't know if you want to maybe talk a little more on that when you do the finding follow up,
Sure.
what
So
that process
that's
looks like.
part of the reason why we don't pay out all the aid in January. There's some of it that's held back for these types of things where you find in the audit that some kids were counted wrong, and really instead of 30 kids riding in the 2 to 5 mile category, you really only had 25, and that affects the amount of aid that you're going to get. Normally, there's not enough there to make a district pay money back because of the way that we pay the aid, and we hold some of it back until those audit findings are done. But it does happen. There was one district last year who actually double counted their students. Someone who filled out the report, I think, put students in the regular student category and also reported them in vocational. And the district had about twice as many riders as they had in the previous year, and that district did have to pay money back. So if we find that there's a big discrepancy, yes, it is possible that you would have to pay money back.
Thank you. Another person is a representative for a 2-year college, and they transport high school students to that college for dual credit classes. Can that cost be reimbursed by the state, or can they report that in some way to get some funding?
Not through regular transportation aid reporting. That is strictly for riding the bus to and from school. I do not know if there's another program that would have a grant type payment out of it or something having to do with dual enrollment. I don't know that. But as far as regular transportation aid, that does not figure into that calculation.
Okay. And one more, this person is new to school districts and has never worked in one before. Transportation is part of their role. Any tips or tricks to get ready for reporting and filling out those reports?
I think that one of the things that you want to have available when you're ready to do the report is some kind of the documentation that we talked about. It's going to make it a whole lot easier if you've got that documentation right in front of you when you go in to do the report, and you have 43 kids that are in your UHT zone and that have ridden the bus. You have 25 kids who live more than 12 miles away from school who have ridden the bus at some point during the year. So really, the documentation helps you on both ends of the process. It helps you at the beginning when you're ready to do the reporting, and it helps you if there's an audit and you have to provide that documentation to show the auditors that you have proof that these kids rode the bus. So documentation is the big thing, I would think, to anybody new, to have that right in front of you. It's going to make everything a whole lot easier.
Yep, and keeping that readily available for your auditors, even if they don't end up doing a transportation audit, it's just making sure to keep that documentation, because otherwise we've had times with transportation, with pupil count, which is similar with keeping documentation, where the auditors come to do the audit and the district didn't maybe keep the documentation for, maybe there were changes that were made. So they maybe had like the original counts, but they didn't keep documentation on changes made. And just being able to provide the auditors with the documentation for this is what ties to the number that was reported to DPI, making sure you have that.
And I just want to throw another thing in here. At any time, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. And if, as Olivia said earlier, if the question is more relevant to one or the other of us, we will communicate that between ourselves and we'll get an answer for you. But we are always available to help you if it's your first time through, help you get into that report, help you fill it out correctly, and help you with any audit findings that may come up. Either one of us are always available and willing to help. I'm speaking for both of us, Olivia, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct on that.
Yep.
Thank you. And looks like one last question came in. How does the district determine distance from home to school for audit purposes? Does it have to plug in all student addresses and the school address to get map distance? Can it count the bus route distance, which might be longer than the quickest route home to school?
Okay, as far as that last part, the aid is based on the most normally traveled route, the shortest route between the student's home and the school. I don't know that there's any particular methodology for calculating those distances. I know a lot of districts use Google Maps and just plug the kids' addresses in, and find out where those different radius points are. 2 to 5, 5 to 8, 8 to 12, over 12. And using Google Maps is one way of doing it. I don't know that there's any kind of standard. I have not heard of anything that says, this is what you need to use, as long as you have a way to document how you've come up with those numbers.
Mm-hmm. And from the auditor perspective, I know when I did the transportation ones, I used Google Maps as an auditor. I would say that would be, again, like Kathy said, there's nothing in the audit program that specifically says they have to use Google Maps. But whatever, if they use something different and you use Google Maps and they say, oh, we came up with this student being 4.9, you came up with 5.1, something like, something like that, that would, I believe that's the change in the count category. So,
Yes.
they would kind of having that documentation on hand, for that distance, for how you had determined it. And the audit is not going to look at every single one. They're a test. They're going to take a sample of students. So it's not going to be every single student, but you won't know the sample until the auditors ask for the sample. They'll ask for your listing of the students and their addresses, and then they'll take a sample of that. And so it won't be every single student, but they will take a sample.
I see a couple of things in the chat where people have put in what they're using. Joni says that their bus routing software has a way to assist in measuring the distance from the school to the residence of the student. So that's what they use in their spreadsheets when they do their ridership count with their drivers. And Michelle says that they have typically used Google Maps for mileage. There's one bridge in their district that shows up as a way to get to school on Google Maps, but doesn't allow bus traffic. So we have to pay special attention to those addresses and modify our mileage for those families based on the next shortest route. not using the bridge. That is a
And if
helpful
that would,
example. Thank you.
yeah, and if that's something that your auditors would pull up, if they don't know that that can't be used as transportation, and they do test one of those families that would be in a situation like that, that would again just be something that you would want to make sure to discuss with your auditors. I would, if you have a situation like that, I would honestly bring it up with them even before they test and just say, hey, there's this one bridge here. That way they don't go through and do all this testing and then come up back to you with, hey, we found these 5 students that have been used that didn't use this quickest transportation. So having that discussion with the auditors beforehand, if you know of some sort of situation like that, is always helpful.
And I would imagine that, you know, road construction that changes the routes and you can't go the way that you normally went this year because they're doing this big project. Bring that up again as well. You know, let them know ahead of time that you had to change routes and maybe it went from, you know, being a 5 mile within a 5 mile radius to that next category, to that 5 to 8 miles, because you had to go out of your way. It is now the shortest route to school because of this construction. So, you know, those kids are probably going to move. Some of those kids would probably move from the categories that they were in if that is the case. And letting your auditors know ahead of time, like Olivia said, so that they don't go through the whole thing and then you say, oh, well, but that's why, is probably a good idea.
Well, I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much, Olivia and Kathy. We really appreciate your time. And we really appreciate everyone joining us for today's Transportation Tidbits. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation that was dropped in the chat, or you'll also get that link via email if you don't have time right now. In addition, you'll get a link to the recording as well as the slides, if not late this week, early next week. And we hope to see everybody for our next Transportation Tidbits webinar on April 17th, featuring some speakers from the EPA on electric busing and what opportunities are coming up. And with that, have a great day, and we'll hope to see you in April.